Hello and welcome. This is a re-recording of the Tech Week session, Enterprise Service Management, a panacea for uncertain times. Sorry that the live session didn't record, and there's been a number of requests, so I thought I'd do a short recording for you now of the presentation. So today we're going to look at service management, what it is, where it comes from, and why it matters. And we do so against a backdrop of increasing uncertainty in our world. You can see it for yourselves around you. The pandemic we've been through. We've had the war. We've had inflation. And now we've got a possible recession coming along that we might avoid, but it's still going to be painful. And on the tech side, we've got social media pervading every part of our lives now. We've got Bitcoin, blockchain, distributed finance that's revolutionizing the financial sector, and of course generative AI that you can't miss at the moment. Absolute leaps and bounds in some of the really human-looking answers that are coming out of these questions. Very insightful stuff. So the possibilities seem endless, but also the scale of challenge facing our businesses when you look at them, that they're still dealing with paper workflows and there's people not working in structured ways. So it is quite hard for businesses to change and adapt. And that is something that is also hard to keep up, right? As a human being, as an individual, it's really hard to keep up with everything that's going on. So hence the question today: can service management be a panacea for human times? Can it help us through what we need to sort of overcome this, to have something to hold on to? And as an example, imagine you're in a primary school and you're doing a science experiment, and it's electronic because that gets complicated, and you're trying to get this bulb to light up, but you can't do it. So what would the teacher tell you to do, right? There's a lot of factors on this board, there's a lot of wires, a lot of buzzers and resistors and all sorts on here. What would they tell you to do? Rip everything out, just start doing things at random, see if you can get it to work? No, it's a science experiment. They'd tell you to hold on to the constants and change one thing at a time. All right, and that is the secret of science, is to hold things constant so that we can make assumptions, or we can make small changes to figure out what's happening. So by doing that and having something to hold on to, then that's an option to get through this uncertainty. So is service management such a constant? Well, we'll have a look at that today. We'll start off by going through the challenge that we face, so this exponential growth and disruption, and the counter argument to that you don't often hear, but it's that the productivity is barely registering despite all this technology. So we'll look at some reasons for that and see that IT has been dealing with this stuff for a while, right? IT's dealt with certain uncertainty and complexity for a long time. Therefore, they've come up with all these standards and frameworks that have helped, right? Because back 30 years ago to today, IT's come on a long way thanks to these frameworks and standards. But what is behind them? And that's what we need to ask ourselves today, because now that complexity and chaos is not just within IT, it's actually out across the business. Technology is everywhere. So we can't just rely on the business to come up with these ways of working. We kind of need to help them from a technology perspective, but equally we can't just get IT service management, package it up, throw it over the fence and say to the business to go implement, because it's very tech focused. It's very sort of tailored for the technology scenarios. What we need to do is take these frameworks back to first principles and understand why they work. Right? It's no longer good enough just to say, oh yeah, do this because so-and-so says so. We need to understand the why behind it so we can create a true enterprise framework for the whole business. And that, we argue, is the key to, argue today, is the key to unlocking this productivity. So we will go back in time to ancient Rome to see what's going on. We'll have a look at a Roman store and we'll see striking similarities to our own. We'll look at how they worked and we'll look at the services they offered, and we'll hopefully see some striking similarities and build this into a model, a framework for frameworks, a framework for our digital age, a framework for enterprise service management, true enterprise service management. And then, not content with that, we need to actually make this framework work for us. So we're going to apply it to project management. And then we're going to use it, not only that, to derive some insight. We're going to derive configuration management as a practice or a way of working. And we're going to see some quite interesting and striking things that impact sort of one of the most complex and poorly understood practices within IT. And then we'll look at where's next and yeah, in the live session I would have taken questions. Of course I can't today, but there we go. But please do feel free to email me any questions afterwards. I'm happy to answer those or discuss them on LinkedIn. That's great. So about me, physics background. I've been with Deloitte now for about 10, 11 years or so. Worked in a number of roles. So worked across 2 major retail programs in the UK that were transformational, affecting most areas of their core business, and worked in most program roles on that. So started out in PMO, went through engineering, release and config, environments, testing, a bit of architecture, design. So the whole works really, deployment, implementation, and then sort of did some project management and then into program management as well, leading a number of about 10 different projects for this large omnichannel ordering program. So been around, seen a lot of stuff, and that plus a sort of science background, kind of gives you a bit of a sense of where this has come from. Then came to New Zealand, and instead of being a consumer of service management that was constantly trying to get stuff through operations teams and get changes through, and constantly ask for more information, or we haven't engaged as early enough, and all these kind of things that operations teams do, you kind of start to move to the actual service management side and understand why all these processes are in place and why the operations teams were doing what they did, and have the opportunity to help them improve as well. So using ServiceNow as a platform for work, using it to improve the way service management happens, and over time, did a number of these implementations and ServiceNow projects. And one notable occasion, I was asked to help a large government organisation transform their ways of working. So they had a new operating model, and they were looking to reduce headcount by 90%. So their old clunky ITIL v3 based ways of doing things within service management just weren't going to cut it. Far too many handoffs, far too many delays. They needed massive efficiency savings. So I had to really look at all of their ITSM and go, ITIL 3 isn't going to cut it. It was 10 years old at the time, and it was creaking at the seams, and it's as we know, it's now been replaced. But effectively, we needed to start again. Take that back to first principles, go, what is an incident? What is a request? What is a change? What are they actually aiming to do? You'll see some of this later in the presentation. So what is the essence behind these things, and why do they work? And start building up an actual interconnected model, because we needed to get work through the system. You needed to get a customer's issue, get it through to a team to resolve. Oh, there's a change required, get the change raised, automatic, and when the change is finished, come back, close the incident, close the issue, notify the customer. We can't have people in there having to wait and just being, human passing updates on tickets. We needed everyone to touch those tickets minimal times and for the system to do the heavy lifting. So that was implemented, went live, no major issues on day one. I thought that was quite an achievement, really. But since then, the real sort of benefit out of it has been this framework that's come out of it, which I hope to share with you today. So managing the digital disruption. So this is the relatively standard sort of consulting part of the presentation, where we say, oh yeah, looking at this across the industry trends, all these things are happening, and it's so far so widely reported, right? So we've got processing power exponentially growing by Moore's law every 4 years. Now you may be looking at your phone and your laptop in front of you and thinking, these aren't really going up in processing power. I bought a laptop a little while ago because I needed a replacement, and it was virtually the same spec as the one I had 2 years ago. Right, so things aren't really moving because they're kind of powerful enough. Right, you don't really need the power the same way you did back in the early 2000s, when 2 years was a vast difference. But this curve still holds in things like generative AI. So ChatGPT, for instance, if you look at the number of incrementations that the model goes through, it is exactly this model. So ChatGPT 1 on the left through to ChatGPT 3 and 3.5 and 4, right? And it's exponentially growing the power of that model, and that's why we're seeing much better and better answers. So the curve is still happening. It's just not happening it's happening in different areas, right? Tech is evolving. Data, on the other hand, is growing rapidly, especially with Internet of Things, sensors providing massive amounts of growth. And we can see that through the sort of other tech trends as well. Everything's generating data. Of course, that's more tech to play with, more opportunities, but also more obsolescence, right? So this is where we get disruption from. The fact is we need to keep moving in order to keep up. That requires exponential thinking, so we can't assume that by changing today, changing tomorrow, it's at the same rate. Running one change program a year is going to be good enough, because it isn't. We need more and more each year, and it's kind of an ever-increasing treadmill, and it's almost impossible to keep up. Right? And that's all true. However, it's not the full story. On the left is what you'd expect from exponentially increasing tech. You'd expect exponentially increasing benefits in the form of productivity, right? The more technology people have, the more we can automate, the more we can produce. However, look at the last 20 years in New Zealand, and this is the same story across the world. Productivity has fallen. It's barely registered. All this technology, all the computer boom, the shift from memos to computers for work, for email, you've got the rise of social media, chatbots, AI, everything else. Nothing. Not a dot blip on that productivity growth. And there's been a lot of sort of head scratching around this. Why is this the case? Some people have said, oh, it's because of underinvestment in assets, underinvestment in skills, and all the rest of it. But I want to put it to you that there's one factor that's really impacting this, and that is it's a very human factor. The more stuff we have a finite capacity for change as humans, right? And you look at how many change you've got in your own organization, how much change you can actually get people to adopt and adapt to, right? And there's only so much effort you can put in, that people are prepared to put in. And yes, you can make things intuitive, but ultimately to do that requires a lot of effort. And in order to get even to that point, you've got to have done your options analysis, and you've got to have figured out which way to turn. And when there's more and more options around it, it gets harder and harder to do that. So you end up with paralysis by analysis. So complexity and chaos is holding us back. And the question is, as a business, how do we unlock that? How do we cut through it and really unlock that exponential growth and disruption? And it is a major challenge, and one that we need to overcome if we're going to have any hope of dealing with the major challenges that we face, like climate change and inequality and sustainability and those sort of things. So that's on a macro scale. But remember, history repeats itself. Everything comes and goes. There's nothing new under the sun. IT's dealt with this before, right? IT is vastly complex, and you imagine it working without the structures that we've got in place today, it wouldn't. So back in the sort of 70s, 80s, you had people prodding servers with broom cupboards, and prodding servers in broom cupboards, and they were all experts, right? They did their job. They supported the business. But it wasn't simply enough to do that and have them go off for coffee over lunchtime while the business was facing major disruption. They needed some kind of service level in there. They needed some kind of contract with the business to enable them. So you ended up with IT service management, ways of dealing with incidents, issues, requests, and changes and stuff in order to get work done effectively and to agreed standards. So that was all well and good, but then the business realized that, IT were giving them stuff, but not necessarily what they wanted. So they demanded a stake in what IT was doing. They demanded a partnership, and hence we get to ITIL v3 with and 4 with where IT is a partner of the business. Some have realized that you can go a little bit further than that. These ways of working are actually quite applicable across things like facilities and HR and legal. And they've all got service desks, and they all sort of they deal with issues, inquiries, they deal with structured requests. Why not sort of combine this together? Why not make it an enterprise shared service and push out sort of IT ways of working into these areas and get them to follow good practice? And that's really good and effective, and many organizations are doing this. Some are labeling it enterprise service management. I will argue it isn't. What we need to do to get to true enterprise management is what I mentioned at the beginning. So we need to break down the barriers. We need to be able to give the business a way of coping across the whole organization, which means we can't just package up ITSM, throw it over the fence. We need to actually distill it back and figure out why it works and give them a proper framework that covers the whole organization and not just IT. We need to break down this arbitrary distinction between IT and business, because it's no longer relevant. If in the old times there was definite discrete IT, but now IT is everywhere. In fact, IT is actually providing direct customer service at many banks. and the lines are already blurred, so why not break them down? And I think that will really start to get you to think in a more enterprise way. And you see a lot of these examples, in this presentation and the next one that Darren's doing, will not involve IT at all in some cases, and everything still holds. There is one final step in this journey that will really unlock the growth, and that is recognizing that our enterprise is not just in isolation, but is actually part of an ecosystem. So many organizations are starting now to expand their horizons. They're starting to look to outsource various parts of their organization, but also start to interconnect their service management as well. So you can have work flowing seamlessly between the parties. That's sort of become, people have been outsourcing for years, but now they're actually trying to start to exchange work a lot more seamlessly. And that bit will become ultimately an interconnected model, and that's where we need to aim to. In order to do that, we kind of need common ways of working across all organizations. So actually something like these frameworks that IT's got become even more important, that we can make them enterprise and then share them basically and have everybody working in the same sort of way. But it's not a one size fits all. It's not a prescriptive way because every organization is different. We just need to understand what's important. So anyway, these are the frameworks and methodologies that IT's got. There's ITIL, which is your instance problems changes, it's service management ways of working. IT for IT gives you a data model, so it starts fitting these things together and give you a bit of an architectural view of what an IT shop should look like. You've got TOGAF, which is about architecture, so it's about looking at where you want to be, and it's about creating target states to get there, and there's a methodology around that and governance in place. COBIT has more structured governance for IT, which is also generally drawing on business principles. I mentioned SIAM before, Service Integration and Management. This is a methodology around getting in-source and outsourced providers working in a sort of on an even playing field and in a collaborative way. So that's really helpful and important. You've got Lean to reduce waste in process, which has been around for a little while. And then you've got DevOps and Agile. So DevOps is about recognizing that development and operations can be brought together to shorten life cycle, improve ownership and accountability. And you've got Agile, which is about flexibility rather than delivering something monolithic at the end, deliver in increments. All these quite IT focused. What is behind them? Where have they come from? Why do they work? These are the key questions that we need to answer in order to take all of this good practice and pass it out to the enterprise. So we're going to go back in time to do this. We need to go back way before IT was ever considered. We're going to go back to ancient Rome and have a look at a Roman store and see how they managed their commerce. And hopefully we'll see some striking similarities to today. So this is our Roman store. This is in Pompeii, so a great place to visit if you're ever in the area on holiday. I went there, and this wasn't exactly my photo. I have a very similar one to this, but my wife was standing in the middle. I don't think she'd appreciate being on the slide today, so we have a clean copy of this, which has basically it's a fast food outlet. So you can imagine food or olives or something stored in these jars. And they were selling them to customers, as you'd expect. It's a shop, a fast food shop, right? They might have had ovens out the back. They might have been making pizza out there. Who knows, right? It's open to interpretation. There's probably some evidence in there or some sign I didn't read. But anyway, you can imagine what you want for the purposes of this. So as a consumer, how would you interact with this store? You could use the store by making a purchase. So you can go up to the counter and you can ask them for something in that jar. So you're being a consumer, right? And you're using this at the store. You could say there was something wrong with that food. Say the pizza was cold and they'd advertise it as hot pizza. Well, you could go and you'd expect to go back and raise an issue with that and say, hey, please heat it up. Something wrong. What if you wanted a menu item, right? You'd make a request for that menu item. They'd follow the steps in the recipe and they'd provide you with that pizza with your custom toppings. What if you had an idea? What if you came to them and said, I want you to cater for our upcoming wedding? What would happen then? It's an idea because they don't currently provide that service, but they will consider that idea. And then you've got the relationship as well. What if you've got a debt with them? What if you've got some account credit? What if they said they'd owe you a pizza next week, right? You can discuss that as well and try and claim that. And finally, you might want to give some feedback, or they might want to get some feedback from you. So these are all ways that you can interact. There's no shiny service management system. It's just simply interacting with the store owner, having a conversation. But all these ways of working very valid today, as well as they were back then. So let's put them into a model. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to understand the ancient ways of working and then model them so that we can use it today. So here's our interactions across the top that the consumer has. And we can see they fall broadly into 4 camps, right? They're either using the service, they need some support through an issue or a structured request, they want to discuss some aspect of managing the service, or they want to discuss some aspect of governance around getting feedback. That's all well and good, but we need to deliver on that as an organization. So we need to make all of our food available, right? We need to constantly make sure those pots are stocked, and that's availability management. We need to deal with the incidents that underlie the customer's issue. So if the fire's gone out, that's an incident. That's why the pizza's cold, and that's why the customers are raising issues. So you might have many issues, and you can fix that incident in order to resolve it. You might have you'll have tasks to resolve the request. They might go through a series of chefs and a head chef at the end. There might be an initiative. Initiative, of course, would be needed to spin up the wedding service, right? Because they currently don't do it, so they need to put pen to paper and figure out how to do it, or scribe it to a wax tablet or something similar. There's relationships with many providers. There needs some form of way of managing all the different providers as well. And then finally, you need to actually direct on the basis of feedback as well. So direct all the previous mentioned. So that is what an organization will naturally do. What service management provides is another layer on this, which is the ensuring layer. So this is about making sure that food is available by having continuity plans in place. So what happens if a supplier can't make the delivery of wheat in the morning? Well, we can go to another supplier, for instance. What happens if someone's sick? Well, we have redundancy within our team, so we can call on someone else. Those kind of things. Why does the fire keep going out? Well, that's a problem, and we can have a look into that. We can have an investigation and go through a structured process to figure it out. What about change? Change control. So when we send out a new dish or a pizza to the customer, we don't want the junior chef who's just arrived giving that to the customer without someone looking over it. There's a form of change control. What about release as well, making sure that we're actually going to give the customer something they want. So for that wedding service, for instance, we need to make sure that we've tested it and that the customer's actually going to get what they want from that and they're not going to be disappointed. Likewise, portfolio. Do we want to make sure we're offering the right services to customers? And we want to do so in line with our strategy. Underpinning this is data. So configure how our service is configured, the knowledge that we're using, a understanding of risk and cost, ability to report and measure and communicate that, and finally insights, which is the fourth pillar of governance. So COBIT has evaluate, direct, and monitor. I would argue there's insight as well, because governance without some kind of visionary element to it isn't really an enterprise. You can govern an organization, but an organization in pursuit of value, which is an enterprise, needs some direction in the vision, and that's kind of where you get it from. So your leadership should bring insight as well as the ability to evaluate, direct, and monitor. So these are not entities, these are not teams that are formed around doing each of these. As we've seen, the chef will manage requests, tasks, changes, and also probably risk and cost as well, and various other things. They'll deal with issues, right? Everybody does this stuff. It's the way of running sustainable services. It's just a series of activities and a way of thinking about work. But that's all well and good, right? We can run a sustainable service using all those things. But what exactly are we offering? What makes us different as a Roman store? And that is that we're offering 3 types of services in this case: food, beverage, and event catering. Right? They're what makes us unique. These are the things that customers want. They don't want to have to do it themselves. They don't want the individual costs and risks that fluctuate. They want a pair price, and they want to receive the output that gives them some value. So there's a value generation for all parties. Let's have a look at that in a bit more detail. So what exactly is going on? Let's try and model it. So we have our organization headed by our fine, upstanding Roman senator, who is probably not going to do this themselves. They're going to appoint an agent, an integrator, to help out. They're going to put some governance in place. So they're going to go and, based on their thoughts, they'll be like, I want to go and offer a new fast food store, right? And I want to put a new pizza service in, and I'll put a new pizza oven to offer pizza in. So they're going to direct the integrator to go out and generate some new or some demand for a new unchanged service. The integrator is going to go and appoint a provider with consent of the organization to commission that service and make it available to use. So we're going to get a new chef, and they're going to know what to do in order to make those new pizzas. Now, when the consumer uses that service, there's going to be a set of expectations that they have. So there's going to be a service contract there. And this would have been implicit in the Roman days in most cases, especially in a shop that you go to. But there's a series of expectations that you have when you go and get your lunch. So you know that if you've bought hot food, it's hot. If you bought cold food, it's food that should be tasty, it should be fresh, and it shouldn't be moldy. All right, so there's basic set of obligations there, and that is the service contract. So it's how things should be. And as a consumer, because you've paid for this service, you have a right, if you notice an issue, to go to and get some support if there's something wrong. And again, if the food's cold, you'd expect them to do something, right? You'd expect them to give you a new pizza or to give you your money back or something like that. And again, you have a set of expectations about how they should handle it. And if the storekeeper's rude, then you have the right to go and chat with the manager, right? Because they deal with the relationship. And again, you've got a set of expectations here as well. You'd expect the manager to take some action and remediate it. Otherwise, you can terminate your relationship and not come back. Right, that's your right as a consumer. You don't have to keep using the service. And that is basically how a service works. And we've seen how those aspects of work before on the previous slide align with the actors as well in some form of life cycle. So putting this all together, how can we make a model for today? Let's put everything we've learned together. So what we've kind of discovered is this is a dimensional model, right? Each sort of those aspects cover a complete dimension of the organization. So do the services, so do the actors. So we've seen services, we've seen those aspects of work, use, support, manage, and govern. We can do that against any service. So the 2 dimensions there. We've also got actors as well. They're another dimension. So each of these actors can be involved in any service, and they can be involved in any aspects of work. Right, we have a consumer of the service, a provider of the service per ITIL. We add the integrator in per SIAM to manage all the different providers. And of course, we recognize in ITSM that there is an organization fundamentally that is driving this. Right, the organization is the reason that it's there. We've also got a number of structures in our organization. So it's not just services we can offer. We can roll those services into portfolios. We can have functions as well that cut across multiple services. So they're just people probably performing discrete tasks across everybody. So maybe there's a cleaning function that's part of all services. You wouldn't necessarily, structure that as a service. Everything's a service at the end of the day, but you don't have to formally structure it as such. And then you can bundle that into capability centers. Mainly more providing that sort of standards and guidance kind of aspect. So they're not actually offering anything, they're just kind of guiding people and that sort of thing. So it's really just to reflect your organization. You can structure your organization how you want as a CEO or an organization owner. That's the entities, and then you have assets. So this comes from the old adage of people, process, and technology. Notice, of course, we live in the digital age. We've got to add data in there. That's a huge asset. You see the ransomware providers and how much money gets scammed. Data is definitely an asset. And then also, is it really people anymore? We can have fully automated services. So therefore, what is it about people that makes them special? Right? They're stakeholders, but they fulfill a particular role, and that role has a purpose. Right? Because AI can also fulfill that role as well. It's the decision making, it's the creativity. Right? That's the purpose. That's why we bring people in. It's the customer service and relationship and that sort of thing. It's an asset, right? We don't need to use a person for it, but people do bring it very well to it. So a multi-dimensional model, and I think this is a rather unique way of looking at the organization that we've not really seen before, and it really helps to cut through and give some clarity when we're trying to design things, when we're trying to understand where we're coming from. So let's hold that in mind. We've also got as well as dimensions that describe our organization, we've also got a number of considerations to make. So we've got our goals that we want to align to. Of course, our mission, where are we heading? We've got principles to keep us in check, and our resource as well, which powers all of these things. We can't do any of this without certain types of resource. And what we get is if we start to put this together, we can see a very striking similarity to an object in free space. All right, so we're basically saying that our organization is like an object. It's a ball. We know it's a ball in free space or something similar. We know everything there is to know about it because we've got the dimensions and we know what each of those are. We also know that we want to move this object to somewhere else. Right, so we want to move it towards a vision state. Right, so as far as we can go. And we want to do that in accordance with the mission. So the purpose of this enterprise, this organization in pursuit of value, that's the mission. So we want to move from A to B. We do that by using goals and principles to keep us on course and resource thrusters along our way. So we've defined an initial state and a target state. Now, our path between the states is not going to be straight necessarily, because there are external forces that we can't control that are going to impact us on our way. They may hinder or they may help. So, for instance, your social media ad going viral is going to be a help, whereas someone being found out and dragged through the media for something they said or did that wasn't right is going to be a massive hindrance. There's a sort of social forces, political forces, might be an earthquake. If you're an insurer, that's definitely going to hit you. It might be about the interest rates or inflation or things like that. So of course we must recognize what we can control versus what we can influence, and ultimately our potential, because that sets our vision state. So these are spheres of control, influence, potential, and finally a sphere of visibility at the end there. Now these spheres can cross and they can overlap. Of course, like imagine COVID, that was a big one that was outside of everybody's sphere of visibility. No one was affecting that, and it hit everybody. Right, so we've got to be conscious of these spheres when we're making decisions and drawing up the model, right, because they act as almost our scope or limit of what we can achieve. So it's worth keeping those in mind. So all of this together can help us design and understand our organization better. And that's great. We can define and we can describe, we can define our organization. But in order to make a framework actually practical and useful, we need to apply techniques in order to describe our organization. We need to use methods which will apply techniques to answer questions. Right, how do I get the maximum value from the service? What services should I offer? Questions. We need methods in order to answer them. And finally, how do we know we're asking the right questions? We need guidance. And this is where people have understood that there is commonality between organizations, and we can actually create common good practice as well. And that is what a framework seeks to offer. Now this is, repeating the model. ITSM is a repeating cascading model of 4, always 4 dimensions. Seems to work with the natural world that models our organization. We're not seeking to create anything here. We're just simply seeking to understand the organization. So everything here should align with reality. But what we've got is our components that we've discovered before, so the dimensions, considerations, forces, and spheres. We've got a number of techniques we can apply to those components to take our information and turn it to knowledge. And then our methods as well. We'll have a question. They'll have steps that we go through, input and output and validation. So that helps us build a method. And finally, guidance. There are a number of sources for this. So one is the framework, that universal good practice that I mentioned. Second is your own logic. Right, does it make sense? Test everything. We're not asking you to take any of this for granted. You can apply it yourself and figure it out, right? The guidance should be aligned with logic. The traditions and policies within your organization are also important. They provide context, right? People have been through this before. And then you finally got your own experience as well, your own tangible experiences. So they will help you to understand the context and appropriately respond as well. So this is quite an abstract model. It's a class model for the enterprise. So it covers every type of enterprise, basically, organization in pursuit of value. What you need to then realize is that this is, your framework. Underneath this will sit your object model of your organization. And we'll cover the config in a minute, but that is effectively the object model. So it's how this translates to your specific circumstances. And finally, that model should reflect the reality of your organization on the ground. Okay, so all 3 need to be in sync in order to make this work. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build a holistic picture. But did I say this needed to be a human enterprise? What about the ants? What about nature? There is an organization of ants. They are definitely in pursuit of some kind of value. They want to expand their colony. And this bug is definitely going to be consumed. And there is a provider of that bug. These 2 are taking it back to the nest. There'll be integrators facilitating with messages about where to go from the queen. And of course, the queen is running the organization. They're going to deal with issues. They're going to fight off bugs. They're going to collect together. They're going to deal with famine, food shortages. They've got assets. They've got food in there. They've got these living larders that they can draw in times of shortage. They've got their eggs and everything they need to sustain the colony. Yeah, and there's loads of actors, and they build up into complex social structures as well. So why not? Why can we not model other things using this as well, any type of entity? And we're asked this question, a panacea for uncertain times. Sure, is something that is this generic, does this kind of give us a bit of an indication that maybe we're onto something here? Is this enough? That's sort of the question that we can ask here. Now, as I mentioned, panacea is kind of usually the answer is no to this, but it's something to hold on to. That's what we're trying to aim and achieve today. Right? Is this the constant? And when we've discovered ancient ways of working that are applicable back in ancient Roman times, plus potentially applicable outside of the human realm, it feels a bit more universal. Right, so maybe hopefully you can agree with me. There's something here that's a little bit more than what you normally get. So we've seen how we can build this framework up that's generic, and that's great. It models our organization, but how do we actually apply it? Right, what can we actually do with this? And I wanted to give you the first method that came out of this. So the question was, how do I design a target state for a project? And I've used this a few times on a number of different projects, and it's a great sort of validation tool to use. So might not want to throw out your entire project methodology for this. That's not kind of what it's here for. It's here to get you to a design and help you to consider all the different aspects of it. But effectively what it's doing is it's saying use the techniques of just looping through the model. So you go through it one layer, and then you pick one that you want to focus on, and then you expand that out, loop through again, pick one and expand out, loop through again. And you can then rinse and repeat that, and so go back over as many times as you need depending on the complexity, because all these things are interrelated. And it just helps you make sure that you've covered everything. So we have, starting with the project, you want to get an understanding of the context of it. So how far do we want to go? How far can we go? What can we control? Get an understanding of the forces, how much resource we have, goals, principles, vision, and then expand out the dimensions. So understand the types of the realm of the service that we're offering, the different aspects of it. So as well as designing the service for use, how's it going to be supported, how's it going to be managed, how's it going to be governed? Right, we can use that aspects model that we saw earlier for that. Understand what the actual structure of this is going to run like in steady state. Is there going to be a team that's dedicated to this? Do we need to interface with a number of teams? How do we get them to play together? What are the actors in this? Who's consumer? Who's provider? What are their needs? That helps us form our requirements. And then we can expand out the assets that we need and start actually designing some purpose, process, data, and tooling. So purpose is an interesting one, and a lot of times people will come back with process flows, where they've designed something up and they've gone, yeah, this is the process flow. And usually the response back to that is, no, take that back. Don't just design a process flow based on what you think. Take it back to first principles, figure out what the key inputs are, outputs, and decision points. And then, rather than modeling from as is, model it from that. So you want to connect your input with your decision point with your output. And that is how to build a good process map. So by understanding the purpose behind the process, you can get a good process. By understanding the data required also, that can help inform your process as well. It may influence the number of decision points you need to collect the right data to drive the process. And of course the tooling facilitates that, so then you can then put that into the tool. And then you can go back around and validate. So is that meeting ultimately up to the objectives that you had when you began? So this is not something that you need to go to the nth level of detail. Sometimes even just a sentence or note to yourself that you've actually considered it is sufficient for this. Go to the level of detail that you actually need. Okay, there is a worksheet in the back of the ITSM framework if anybody wants to have a go at this themselves, and that can help you go through it. So that's just one sort of method that came out of the framework. There's other things we can do with this framework is try and get some insights. So looking at configuration, something that's traditionally not been done very well in organizations and asset management, we can start to, so can we actually use the framework to figure out where this comes from and why it's and how it should work. And what we've got here is our entities. So we've got those from the previous diagram, our structure within our organization. Now, as I mentioned, you have complete control as a CEO or leader of your organization as to how you want to structure it. You can draw up that org chart however you see fit, and you can provide whatever services you see fit. Right, it's your organization. Those are things to you that have value. Right, and you want to make them as logical as you can, but that's ultimately your choice. Underneath each of those services, they have assets that they need to deliver to those services. So the assets are acquirable by the organization using the resource. and they have some value, right? They require investment and maintenance. And these assets are ascribable, so they are owned by someone in the organization. That is kind of the definition of an asset, really. Otherwise, it's a resource if it's not really truly owned. It's not really truly a thing. All right, so you want to have these assets and make sure that they are owned by someone in the organization. There's a clear accountability link. All right, so how do we do that? What we want to see as an org leader is how these assets, things that cost us money, generate the value that we want. Right? So how do we link the two? So we need to look at one dimension in terms of another. So we need to look at all the services and all the entities in terms of the assets that sit underneath them that they own. And that is the configuration. So it's how assets are configured in order to serve. All right, and that configuration is the sum of the configuration items plus the relationships between them. So assets have value, configuration has use, right, and entities generate value, as we mentioned. So imagine this as air conditioning units. Right? You've got 10 of them, and you want to provide temperature as a service within your organization to the floor. Okay. So those air conditioning units are in boxes at the moment, and they're not set up. So their assets, check, have value. They don't have use. They've not been got out of the box and configured. They've not been set up, right? And the configuration is where you put them and what temperature you set them to and what the control mechanisms and all that feedback loops and that kind of stuff is in there, where your sensors are. That's the configuration, right? And in order to, and once you've done that, you can then provide temperature as a service. So all this stuff traditionally is sat within a configuration management database. Right, but what are the issues with a traditional database? Why do we not see what I'm describing in our traditional CMDBs? And hence, perhaps, why do most of them fail to realize the value? According to Ford, it's like 85% or something, and I'd probably argue it's higher, because those are the ones who've admitted to it in the survey. So if you look at your CMDB, do you have entities in there? Do you have logical things like business services in your CMDB? Traditionally, people don't, right? Because they're in the too hard bucket. Firstly, you've got to agree on a definition. What is a business service? Secondly, you've got to get everyone to agree what they are, right? And there's loads of different, disputes and arguments about that. And third, they end up being really abstract and academic, so no one actually uses them because no one knows what they mean. Right? They don't mean anything to the business because it's been treated as an academic exercise. What we're saying here is that your entities should reflect your org structure, your op model, and they should mean something to the CEO. The CEO, the head of the organization, should know exactly what they mean, and they should have defined what they are. Right? That's your org chart op model, because we want to link entity with asset. All right, and then once we also note that in traditional CMDBs there is no ownership. Why not? Right? I mean, there might be the old relationship starting to creep in now in like ServiceNow, CSDM and stuff. There are a few implicit ownerships in there, but there's certainly not a chain. There's certainly not a model of ownership in there. And yet ITSM says it's essential. ITSM says that you want to be able to link your assets to your entities, and their assets are ascribable, they're owned, they're accountable by somebody. All right, so we need a model of ownership in there where there's only one parent owner, because only one person can own and be accountable for something. You can have many responsible, but only one accountable. Otherwise there is no accountability because everybody ducks it. So, for instance, if you've got a service of restocking wood in that Roman store, who's going to be responsible for it? Someone needs to take accountability for making sure someone is going to be doing that. Otherwise, you'll end up with incidents. So we've seen we can organize our assets into entities for the pursuit of value. So that's the definition of an enterprise. And there is an ownership hierarchy in there. And we've also seen two types of classes of relationships. So we've seen our ownership class of relationship. And we've also seen dependency class. So I'm not saying that we need to throw everything out that you do in the CMDB traditionally. Maybe throw out the logical layers that don't make sense. But you can keep all of the stuff that you've discovered and everything in there. Just put in the op model on top, the org chart on top, and then make the link. And you can still keep all the dependencies as well. They're just a different class. It's a different model to look at. And then as an example of that, this is a government organization, the one I mentioned at the beginning, where they needed the 90% headcount reduction and efficiency to match. So we got this new CMDB for them stood up in about a couple of weeks, really. It was sort of designed and agreed. Because as I mentioned, we were using the operating model, which had already been pre-agreed. So they needed this in order to get their ITSM working. And their previous CMDB had 10,000 orphan CIs in it, and a config team of 3 people had spent 3 years trying to get it to work, and they populate all those relationships, and they hadn't managed it. They barely touched a fraction of it. All right, 3 people, 3 years. And we managed to put this in within a couple of weeks, just using these principles. All right, so there's a top-down hierarchy of ownership. They had 3 layers. Bit of a compromise for the project, but it was the first time we were doing this, so it's and it worked enough. So those layers were populated, and then the owners were asked to add any further detail and also tell us what technical CIs they were responsible for as well. And they were also asked to map any dependencies. Now, the reason they were incentivized to do this is because adding detail means they can correlate events and have it assigned to them. And adding dependencies means that if the service they're dependent on goes down, then they don't get pinged on their SLA because we know there's a dependency, right? They've recorded it. So there was an incentive for them to keep this up to date, and also work was routed off the back of this, so everything had an assignment group on it, and that was how work was routed through the system. So if they didn't keep the assignment group up to date, the work went to the wrong place. Right, and we'll see in a minute that as work goes through the system, people actually didn't need to assign it manually anymore. As that was one of the big changes on day one. And I thought this would be a massive change and it would create a heap of impact. But actually nobody noticed at all. There was no comments, no feedback, nothing. Everyone just used it, and they thought, and it just worked. Right? No one took any notice of it. They just did it, and I thought that was quite revealing, really. That actually this is intuitive. And you might be thinking, well, how on earth did you get the users and staff to pick something? Because if you look at our CMDB, there's 10,000 CIs in there, and it's all a mess, right? That's what a lot of organizations think. But by having this tree, it makes it a lot cleaner and a lot simpler. And what we do is we get the user to start off the process, right? We expose the CMDB to the user, something unthinkable in the past. And it's an evolving journey. So the user picks something, anything. They can get it wrong. Right? We know they're going to get it wrong. They're not experts. Doesn't matter. Right? Let them pick something, anything. Because the chances are they will probably get it approximately right in most cases. And if they do that, it means we can then possibly try and triage. We can override the triage. So if you've got for instance, like if you're a tax agency and you've got a tax system, or if you're a housing agency, you've got a new housing system, they might be in program mode. They might have a hypercare team on it. Service desk knows nothing. They've not been trained on that yet. Right? So what you can do is you can set the CI to override the triage group on it and send it straight to the hypercare rather than going through service desk and having them go back to the user and go, I don't know what this is. So by doing that, you can get it through triage really quickly, and you also know what everything's with. You can track all those issues in the moment they're raised, and then you get triage to do the actual update of the CI down to the more reasonable level of where it should be, and you can enforce a level they need to go to. Once they've got it there, then it goes to the right support group fixes it, and then they can update it down to the technical CI on resolution. Because on resolution is when we actually know what the CI at fault was. So that's how we do it, an evolving iterative journey. And we cover this in more detail in the next presentation. So where next? And we've seen it's a timeless framework, right? It applies from Roman times through to today. It applies to all organizations, including seemingly ants. So, so where next, really? Have we answered the question? Have we done enough? Is it a panacea for uncertain times? Right? Cure-all, possibly not, as we've said. But is it something we can hold on to? Is it a constant? Seemingly so, right? I hope we can agree on that. I mean, we've been through a lot of content today, and thank you for sticking with us. It's been an exponential growth journey, in terms of what we've seen in IT over the years. There's been massive disruption there, but hang on to something constant. That's what we need to do, and that constant is our ancient working practices. So we've created a framework for ITSM, or not really created. I'd argue it's more discovered, because when you create something, you kind of do it how you want, but this is more of an observation exercise, and the idea is whatever we observe goes in the framework, and as long as it's self-referencing, as long as it's got integrity, that sort of thing. So we've created a framework that hopefully stands the test of time and is robust, and I'm sure it will evolve over the years, but it's been relatively stable now. So some of this stuff is pretty stable, and I welcome feedback on it, of course. If you see any issues with it, let us know, because that's all useful feedback, and we can certainly refine it. We've then shown it's not just a interesting curiosity, but actually can be applied to the real world. I've showed that project method that I've used myself on a number of occasions. And then also we've shown how we can get some real insight out of this, so how we can take it further than just, stating the obvious, what the author intended stuff, to actually getting out real insight and, profound things about the way that service management should work. And that is really exciting and really encouraging for me personally over the last 3-4 years, seeing this grow and seeing the capability that this can offer. We've got one example of one client that we'll run through on Friday on the next session, where they've been able to jump, although they should be able to jump from virtually no maturity in sort of the config space up to, sort of leading edge, because they're able to just use the simple concepts outlined in this pack. And that is it. It's designed to be simple. It's designed to make sense. It's not designed to be huge overhead for you. You do the minimum on this. You do what you need. You do what's right for your organization. It simply describes what is, and then you use that to tailor it to your needs. So there's plenty more. Have a read through the framework. It's a few years old now, and things have moved a little bit, but it is broadly, it is correct, and it is all there. Test it for yourself. Don't just take my word for it. Have a go. Does it make sense? Give us some feedback. And then, join us for the next presentation where Darren and I will show you how to actually take this config stuff to the next level. How you can actually get service management to really work for you once you've got a CMDB aligned with that model that I showed earlier, and the sort of power that it can unlock. And coming back to our original question, just to finish, that sort of being able to model and understand your organization is key to overcoming that exponential disruption and the uncertainty. I think it's fundamental to our economic growth that we don't just focus on tech, because tech always changes. Right? Use the tech, adopt and adapt to the tech, but ultimately understanding our ways of working is what's going to get us through. And it's going to become, it's already a challenge, but it's going to become more and more critical as we face more and more issues. And we're seeing the number of crises that we have to deal with on an annual basis just growing and growing. So I think, there's a challenge there, but there's also real huge opportunity. We've never had a framework like this before, from what I can see. And I really do encourage you to take it and ask questions, get involved, and let's make this something that can truly drive us forwards. Thank you very much.